Today, I want to introduce you to our new series called God's Creative Connection. We begin this series at the day of Pentecost as recorded in Acts. Let's read. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all those who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" This passage describes the day of Pentecost as we have come to celebrate it today in the Christian church, as God pouring out His Spirit upon the believers, empowering them to do things that they would otherwise not be able to do. But there is so much more going on in this story. Just look at the detail included here. Luke goes to great lengths to ensure that we, the readers, know exactly what this looked like and sounded like, and who was there, who witnessed and experienced this phenomenon. Firstly, the coming of the Holy Spirit is described for us here as sounding like the blowing of a violent wind and looking like fire, or tongues of fire, actually. Now, I've been a Christian my entire life, and I've known and experienced the powerful presence of the Holy Spirit in my life many times. But I've never seen a tongue of fire resting on my head or the head of anyone else for that matter. So why such a physically visible appearance of the Holy Spirit at this time? Well, God is communicating with His people here. He doesn't want them to miss or misinterpret what is going on here. You see, when God's powerful presence came upon Mount Sinai in the past, and He gave the people the 10 Commandments, it's described as though sounding like the shout of a loud horn. And a cloud covered the mountain because the Lord had come down upon it in fire. And God led the people. He led the Israelites through the wilderness by a pillar of fire. And God's glory would fill the tabernacle, the very dwelling place of God among His people, with a pillar of fire. And now we see small pillars of fire, or tongues of fire, resting above the heads of the believers as the Holy Spirit was poured out upon them. What God doesn't want His people to miss is this: that no longer would the dwelling place of God be represented by a tent or a building, but that God would now dwell within His people through the Holy Spirit. The fire and the wind is there to tell us that this is the actual powerful presence of God. This is not just a portion of Him. This is the very presence of God upon and with His people. And it has been poured out upon His people who are now the new temple, the new dwelling place of God. The second thing I want us to notice today is the length that Luke goes to ensure that the reader knows that there were Jews from all over the known world present in Jerusalem that day. In the beginning, God created this perfect paradise where humankind lived in harmony with each other, with the earth, and with God. But when humankind chose to define what was right and wrong for themselves, instead of following and trusting in God, everything became twisted. And the relationship between God and his most beloved creation, humankind, was broken. Since then, God has been carrying out his plan of recreation. And at the center of that plan is the restoration of his relationship with humankind. When God called out Abraham to be the father of a nation, the Israelites, he did this in order to bring salvation and restoration to the whole world, to bring peace and justice to the whole world. But because of their continued disobedience, the nation of Israel were conquered by foreign powers time and time again and scattered throughout the whole world. At Pentecost, we see representatives of every tribe of Israel gathered in Jerusalem, believing in Jesus and receiving the powerful presence of God upon their lives through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. They are becoming the restored people of Israel. This is a sign that God, in his goodness and in his love, is rolling out his plan of recreation, and he is undoing the damage that we have done. He was at work then, and he is at work now through us, his people, to bring a world in turmoil and chaos to peace. We are a part of that creative movement of God in our world as we, present-day believers, are still the temple of God. We have within us the powerful presence of a creative God through the Holy Spirit who dwells in us. As we continue in this series, we're going to be stepping back into the book of Genesis and watching how this creative force and presence of God was not just new on the day of Pentecost, but how it has in fact been a creative force for peace and justice since the beginning of creation. So join us as we continue on in this series. We're looking forward to the journey with you and with God as he continues to reveal more of himself and more of his plan to us, his people, his dwelling place.